Welcome to the module on conflict management and de-escalation. People with clenched fists cannot shake hands. Indira Gandhi. What we're about to do is take a splash in the water of conflict, but not a swim. As you learn and practice, you'll become a skilled swimmer in the ocean of conflict. First off, I'd like you to each choose a conflict symbol. Think of a symbol or image that represents conflict or tension to you, similar to what Indira Gandhi's quote implies with the clenched fists. Feel free to search online for examples that you may want to choose. Identify the one that fits your beliefs about conflict the best. So take a moment and write the symbols. You can pause the presentation while you do that. And another example is two fists hitting one another. So clenched fists or two fists hitting one another is another example. And we'll come back to that later on. Next, I'd like to review the learning outcomes, what we're going to work with today. The learning outcomes, you'll find that you'll gain a general understanding of interpersonal conflict and conflict de-escalation in the workplace. You'll learn how effective conflict management builds both personal and professional confidence. Discover the importance of neuroscience in understanding conflict and increase your understanding of your personal style and how it impacts your approach to conflict. So each of these learning outcomes will help you gain perspective on conflict. Some of you may be more versed in conflict than others, but all of us experience it often in the workplace. We have some different sections that I'm going to cover: conflict research and definition, conflict de-escalation, what to do, activity about applying the conflict de-escalation tools. Now keep in mind I'm giving you some of the tools, not everything, because there's a vast array of strategies you can use. Just giving you some of the basic ones that you can put into practice right away. Then we're going over conflict intensity and styles. We're going over applying those conflict styles, because each of us has a style that we tend towards, although we can use any style. We do tend towards one or two. And then we'll go over summary and key takeaways. Now, part of what's important here is the conflict research and the importance of knowing the definition of things, which in the academic world, of course, we focus on quite a bit. So conflict is defined. Interpersonal conflict is a struggle among a small number of interdependent people, usually two, but in our work environments there could be many more, arising from perceived interference with goal achievement. Interpersonal conflict occurs when one person perceives that another person or persons is blocking an important goal that the former is trying to establish. Not all differences between people become an interpersonal conflict, which is good. Differences can add to and be valued in most cases, and it can also lead to conflict. An interpersonal conflict is hallmarked by a feeling of struggle, meaning there is some problem or tension between participants who are invested in the outcome of the situation. So there's some problem or tension. And I want to emphasize, it's not always a conscious, we're not always conscious of the conflict or the situation that's leading to it. We just kind of sense it sometimes. Other times it's very obvious what's going on. So that's conflict defined. Let's look at escalation and de-escalation and define those things. Now, one of the things that I want to emphasize with conflict is that argument and mild disagreement are not considered interpersonal conflict. Sure, those are disagreements and they may raise our anxiety, but those are more minor. So, for example, in higher education, faculty in different disciplines with differing values, language, behaviors, and expectations can lead to conflicts, especially if they are nested within a larger department. So sometimes sciences will have some conflicts between them because of different ways of doing work, or the personalities, or humanities. All of the departments have a certain focus, and oftentimes our beliefs shape around the discipline. And those differences can also lead to conflict. Basically, anything can lead to conflict. Most of the time it doesn't, but sometimes it does. And if there's a graduate assistant in a department, they may be encouraged to see those GAs and those faculty outside the department as in conflict or interfering with a departmental goal of some kind. Now, escalation defined is a communication behavior in which a response to conflict, for example, is designed to expand the size, scope, or intensity of the conflict. Not everyone realizes they might be escalating a conflict through behavior, but let's take an example of something comes up and you disagree with someone on maybe where a file should be filed, where on the shared drive should it go, and even though it's small, it can lead to conflict. If it's an argument or something, or just a different perspective, it's probably not at that level. But if it's beyond just that, and it's like, not again, here we have this conflict. Where do we file the folder, or where do we keep the folder? And the other person starts shouting, either virtually through capitals or through conversation. That's an example of where the shouting can escalate, and suddenly both people are shouting, or one feels hurt because of the shouting. That's an example of a communication behavior which expanded the size or intensity of the conflict, even though the issue itself was fairly straightforward and simple. Now, de-escalation refers to the process of reducing the intensity of a conflict or potentially volatile situation, often through communication strategies and behavioral techniques. The goal is to calm individuals involved, preventing escalation into more aggressive or harmful actions. Now, notice that in this definition, we're trying to reduce the intensity, and sometimes that means calming ourselves, because when we're involved in a conflict, oftentimes our body gets anxious. We start to respond to the increased cortisol in the body, and we're not calm. So we have to calm ourselves, and then sometimes we're helping to calm others at the same time. Now, across the country, there is a lot of conflict happening that takes up a lot of our time. So why is it worth it to learn about conflict? Well, because globally, we spend about a little over 2 hours a week on average dealing with conflict. And in the US, it's 2.8 hours a week, even more than the national or the international average. So clearly it's part of everyday life. Now, when you take that 2.8 hours in the United States, for example, and you multiply it by all the people in the department, that's a lot of time spent in conflict. So don't you think it's worth learning to handle conflict well? And I would encourage you to learn it as an individual, but also as a group. If you have a work team or work environment and you have any influence there, I would recommend that all of you learn about conflict, because that has been shown to improve camaraderie, engagement, outcomes, productivity. Now, U.S. higher education, 30 to 50% of higher education employees report experiencing significant interpersonal conflict at work within a given year. So that's a pretty high frequency in higher education. So it's not just other places. Higher education has its fair share of conflict. 40% of faculty report conflict with colleagues, supervisors, or administration as a regular or semi-regular experience. And 60% of student affairs staff who manage the life outside of class report moderate to high levels of interpersonal conflict with peers, supervisors, or students. So it is a problem across the higher ed environment. universities and colleges and institutions of higher ed across the country and the world are being affected by it. So again, it's worth us spending some time with conflict and learning about it and gaining conflict management skills, conflict de-escalation skills. Now, what's unique about the higher ed environment as opposed to other environments you may be familiar with? For one, oftentimes in higher education, there's limited mobility, and academics often spend decades at the same institution, working with the same colleagues. When you think about that, that means there's some long-term relationships, and if a conflict develops and it goes unaddressed, it can build in intensity over time and get other people involved in it, where you start to take sides or different support different people, and that can cause a lot of strife. And if you're part of the system for a limited time, like if you're a new faculty member or a new GA graduate student or graduate teaching assistant, and you come into that department that's in conflict or that has these very close connections, and suddenly you're the new person, but you're not on the inside. You might perceive conflicts, you might wonder what's going on, or you might experience conflict because you are not an established member of that work group. So when you enter a new environment and you're trying to learn about it, notice the conflict that are going on. There's always something. It just may not be significant. And just see if you can understand what's going on or what the history is, because you're going to experience it one way or another. So the more you intentionally learn, the better off you will be. Another element of higher ed that's unique is resource competition. So we have kind of two rewarding factors. One is we're rewarded for gaining resources, doing publications, getting information as an individual. And yet we're also rewarded for being collaborative, working together, making shared decisions. Those two cultures those two reward systems compete with each other sometimes, so that we become really good with one, but it causes conflict with another, or vice versa. And because of that, those two forces within higher education, there's often a lot more conflict than in other types of organizations because of that different reward systems. So remember, the definition of conflict is when someone feels there's an interference with a goal. So if their goal is resource acquisition and someone seems to be getting the resources instead, that can lead to the conflict. Finally, there's status and power dynamics. So we really have a strong, especially on the academic side, strong hierarchical structure that exists within, again, a collaborative environment. Some parts of the university really focus on hierarchy, say academic affairs. And then others are more on teamwork, although there's still hierarchy, which would maybe be student affairs, for example, or diversity and inclusion units. And those different cultures on campus, again, can lead to status and power dynamics as to who's getting the resources. I'm an individualist, which can be reinforced by certain cultures. Or I'm a collectivist where I want to participate with others and respect the boundaries of others. So higher education has a lot of different systems simultaneously working, which can lead to escalated conflict. And it's worth our time to become more aware of those and to take action. Now, managing conflict in higher education, what works? What's really the key behind it? Well, what they found is the biggest force that changes the nature of conflict in higher education or in other institutions as well is training in emotional intelligence, training in conflict management. Becoming more aware of neuroscience really helps too. It's less about bad people when we get into conflict, and it's more about threatened brains, which means our brains have a response system to protect themselves. And so when there's difference or when there's conflict, we go into fight, flight, freeze, fawn. We go into a variety of neural states that makes it harder to cooperate and harder to get along. And we all have mirror neurons in our brains. When we're around others, those mirror neurons can activate and we start to sense the emotions of others. And we become empathetic to them. Sometimes we override that empathy and stay in conflict, but in other times, empathic responses to conflict can really de-escalate, can calm us physiologically, can calm our thoughts, can help us be more creative and see ways to solve problems more rapidly. Now, conflict outcomes and perceptions are important too. So when we have conflict, there's some negative outcomes and then there's some beneficial ones. So conflict outcomes and perception. We have key negative outcomes, which most of us could guess or are familiar with. One is that 27% of employees have seen conflict lead to personal attacks. So it may start as a workplace conflict about something work-related and turn into more personal critique or personal conflict over time. And then positive impact, for example, 70% of employees see managing conflict as a very or critically important leadership skill. Yet oftentimes we don't learn those skills. We sometimes over-rely on our family systems and how we were raised, or in other ways we've learned about conflict, but not through a systematic study of conflict and conflict management. And then a key perception gap is between managers or supervisors who think they're handling conflict better when most employees think they're handling it worse than they believe. So there's a difference in perception. And it's worth bringing that up with your team and saying, hey, it's worth us consciously and intentionally learning about conflict in the workplace, not waiting for it to happen and trying to muddle your way through in handling it. So it's important to keep that in mind as we learn about conflict and lean into doing something about conflict.